Imagine starting life as an abandoned kid on the Mongolian steppe with almost no power, no army, and barely enough food to survive. Then, a few decades later, you control an army that terrifies entire kingdoms. That was Genghis Khan. He went from Temujin, the son of a minor tribal leader, to the man who united the Mongols and laid the foundations for the largest contiguous land empire in history. And his rise was anything but easy. Temujin was probably born around 1162 near the Onan River in what is now Mongolia, although even his exact birth year is debated. His father, Yesugei, was a tribal chief, which gave the family some status. Then everything collapsed. When Temujin was still a boy, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars. Without him, the tribe abandoned Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and the rest of the family. Suddenly they were basically on their own in one of the harshest environments on Earth, surviving by hunting, fishing, and gathering whatever food they could find. Not exactly the childhood you'd expect for someone who would eventually conquer huge parts of Eurasia. The family situation wasn't exactly peaceful either. Temujin and his older half-brother Bektar fought over food and authority, and eventually Temujin and another brother killed him. Temujin was still a teenager. It was an early glimpse of something that would define his life. If Temujin believed someone threatened his survival or authority, he could be absolutely ruthless. Things somehow got worse. A rival clan later captured him and held him prisoner with a wooden collar around his neck. Temujin managed to escape, reportedly with help from someone inside the enemy camp. By this point, he'd been abandoned, nearly starved, captured, and escaped imprisonment, and he wasn't even 20. Then came Burte. Temujin had been promised in marriage to her when they were young, and the two eventually married. She would become his principal wife and one of the most important people in his life. But shortly after the marriage, Burte was kidnapped by the Merkit tribe. So Temujin did something that would become very useful later. He built alliances. He turned to Togrul, a powerful ruler who had been allied with his father, and also to his childhood friend, Jamukha. Together, they attacked the Merkits and rescued Burte. The campaign taught Temujin something important. One family couldn't dominate the steppe, but alliances could, so he started building them. Temujin also did something unusual for Mongolian tribal politics. He increasingly promoted people because they were useful, not simply because they came from important families. Good fighters, good commanders, loyal supporters. If you could do the job and stayed loyal, Temujin was interested. That helped him attract warriors who otherwise had little chance of rising through the traditional tribal hierarchy. But there was one major obstacle. Jamukha, Temujin, and Jamukha had once been extremely close, reportedly becoming sworn brothers, but as both men gained power, friendship turned into rivalry. The Mongolian steppe gradually split between them, and then they started fighting. The struggle lasted for years. Temujin suffered defeats, rebuilt, formed new alliances, and slowly absorbed or destroyed rival tribes. Groups that had fought each other for generations were being forced under one command. Eventually, Jamukha lost. According to the secret history of the Mongols, Jamukha was betrayed by some of his own followers and handed over to Temujin. Temujin reportedly had the traitors executed, which sounds strange until you understand his logic. If they'll betray him, why wouldn't they eventually betray me? Jamukha was later killed, and Temujin had removed his greatest rival. In 1206, Mongol leaders gathered at a great assembly called a Kurultai. Temujin received a new title, Genghis Khan, better known in the West as Genghis Khan. He had united the major Mongol tribes under one ruler. Now he needed to keep them united. Genghis reorganized his warriors into disciplined units of 10, 100,000, and 10,000, deliberately mixing people from different tribes together. A soldier's loyalty was increasingly tied to the army and the Khan rather than only to his clan, and this army was incredibly mobile. Mongol warriors could travel huge distances on horseback, often carrying several horses so they could change mounts along the way. They were exceptional mounted archers. They could fire while riding, pretend to retreat, pull an enemy out of position, then turn around and destroy them. They used scouts, gathered intelligence, and adapted enemy technology. And when they faced fortified cities, they recruited engineers who knew siege warfare. This wasn't just a giant mob on horses, it was an extremely organized military machine. And now Genghis turned it outward. One of his first major targets was Western Xia. Then came the much larger Jin dynasty in northern China. The Jin had fortified cities, huge armies, and defensive walls. The Mongols had spent most of their lives fighting on open grassland, so they adapted. Captured specialists and Chinese engineers helped them develop siege warfare. By 1215, Mongol forces captured Zhongdu. Today, that's Beijing. Genghis Khan had gone from fighting rival tribes on the steppe to defeating one of Asia's great powers, but his most infamous campaign began because of a trade dispute. To the west was the Khwarezmian Empire, covering much of Central Asia and Iran. At first, Genghis apparently wanted trade. He sent a caravan of merchants into Khwarezmian territory. The governor of Otrar accused them of spying and had them killed. Genghis then sent envoys demanding punishment. The Khwarezmian Shah made an absolutely spectacular decision. One envoy was killed while others were humiliated and sent back. Killing the representatives of Genghis Khan was, as career choices go, not fantastic. In 1219, the Mongols invaded, and Genghis was furious. His armies crossed enormous distances and attacked from directions the Khwarezmians didn't expect. Cities including Bukhara and Samarkand fell. The ruler fled. Mongol armies chased him across his own empire until he eventually died on an island in the Caspian Sea. The campaign was devastating. Cities that resisted could face mass killings, destruction, and enslavement. Medieval casualty figures are often exaggerated or impossible to verify, but there is no debate over the scale of destruction. Genghis understood fear. If one city resisted and was destroyed, the next city might decide surrender was the smarter option. It was psychological warfare on a continental scale. But Mongol rule wasn't only destruction. Genghis generally allowed different religions to exist within his territory and used administrators, craftsmen, engineers, and scholars from conquered peoples. Trade was encouraged. Messengers traveled through a developing relay system. Skills and technology moved between regions that previously had far less contact. The same empire capable of destroying a city could also protect merchants traveling huge distances. It's one of the strange contradictions of the Mongol story: brutal conquest, but also increased connections between East and West. By the early 1220s, Mongol armies had pushed deep into Central Asia. Two of Genghis Khan's generals even traveled around the Caspian Sea and defeated a coalition of Rus princes and other forces at the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223. Europe was starting to hear stories about an army coming from the east that seemed almost impossible to stop. But Genghis wasn't finished. He returned east and turned again against Western Sia, whose ruler had failed to support him during the Khwarezmian campaign. In 1226, Genghis launched another invasion. Then during the campaign, something happened. He died. In 1227, exactly how is still uncertain. Later stories claimed illness, injuries after falling from a horse, or wounds received during battle. There are even more dramatic legends, but we simply don't know. For one of history's most famous conquerors, his final moments are surprisingly mysterious. Even his burial place remains unknown. According to tradition, Genghis was buried secretly somewhere in Mongolia. No confirmed tomb has ever been found. He was around his mid-60s, and in roughly 2 decades as Genghis Khan, he had transformed the political map of Asia. But here's the interesting part. The Mongol Empire didn't fall when Genghis died. It got bigger, much bigger. His son, Ogedei, became Great Khan, and Mongol armies continued expanding. They finished conquering the Jin dynasty, invaded Korea, moved deeper into Persia, and pushed into Russia and Eastern Europe. Genghis's grandson Kublai Khan would eventually conquer all of China and establish the Yuan dynasty. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean towards Eastern Europe and the Middle East. It became the largest contiguous land empire ever created. But managing something that large was another problem entirely. Different branches of Genghis Khan's family began ruling different regions. The empire gradually divided into major khanates: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty. They were all connected to Genghis Khan, but increasingly they had their own rulers, interests, and wars. Some even fought each other. The empire Genghis had built through unification slowly became divided again. So Genghis Khan's story is strange. He was born into tribal rivalry. His family was abandoned. His father was killed. His wife was kidnapped. He was imprisoned. And somehow Temujin became the ruler who united the Mongol steppe. Then he turned those tribes into one of the most effective military forces the world had ever seen. Northern China, Central Asia, Persia, the edges of Europe, kingdom after kingdom suddenly found Mongol horsemen appearing on the horizon. His campaigns caused destruction on an enormous scale, and countless people died as his empire expanded. But his rule also helped create political and trade connections across Eurasia that continued long after his death. Genghis Khan never saw the Mongol Empire at its largest. He never saw his grandson rule China, and he never saw Mongol armies reach deep into Europe. He built the machine. His children and grandchildren kept it running. Then eventually, the same problem Genghis had spent his youth fighting returned. Division, different rulers, different territories, different ambitions. Temujin started with almost nothing. He united the steppe, broke kingdoms, built an empire, and died without anyone knowing for certain how. More than 800 years later, his grave is still missing. But the empire he started changed Eurasia forever. This has been Comic Book Cases. Thanks for joining us on today's deep dive into Genghis Khan. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next one.